Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, the only campfire in the territory where the legends of the West burn brightest. We spin the yarns of the brave, the broken, and the ones who carved their own justice into the unforgiving frontier. Before we ride into the high country with tonight's tale, do us a kindness and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to ring that notification bell. That way, you'll never miss a single story echoing from the canyons. Now, stay quiet and listen to the wind. It still carries the screams from Whisperwind Ridge and the story of the woman who put them there. The wind on Whisperwind Ridge has a voice. It is a lonely, mournful sound that snakes through the gnarled pipon pines and over the sharp, granite teeth of the high pass. It speaks of things lost to time, of promises broken by the harsh realities of the land. For Clara Thorne, that wind was a constant, living reminder of the day her world had ended. Her father, Samuel Thorne, had been the heart and soul of the valley that lay cradled below the ridge. The Thorne Ranch was not the largest or the richest, but it was the most decent. Samuel was a man whose wealth was measured in the loyalty of his hands and the respect of his neighbors. He was a pillar, a rock, a good man in a land that was often ambivalent to goodness. Clara was his only child, and she was a true daughter of the West. She possessed her mother's quiet grace, but her father's iron will. She could ride as well as any man, shoot straighter than most, and she knew the valley and its surrounding ridges as intimately as the lines on her own palm. The end came in the form of the Ridge Runners, the band of highwaymen led by a man named Silas the Jackal Kane. They were not common thieves, they were a plague of locusts, descending on the trade route that was the valley's lifeline, stripping travelers and freight wagons bare with a practiced, brutal efficiency. Samuel Thorne, being the man he was, had decided to stand against them. He had organized a shipment of goods, a decoy, intending to lead a small posse of ranchers to ambush the gang and put an end to their reign of terror. The ambush was a disaster. Kane, the Jackal, was as cunning as his namesake. He had an informant. He knew they were coming. He turned the tables, and Samuel Thorne's posse rode not into a trap of their own making, but into a slaughter. Samuel died as he had lived, on his feet, his guns blazing, trying to protect the men who had followed him. Clara had found him on the ridge, his body riddled with bullets, the wind already whispering its sad song over him. The grief that had struck her was a physical force, a hammer blow that had shattered her world into a million pieces. The valley mourned, the law offered its condolences and its excuses, and everyone expected the young, orphan woman to sell the ranch and flee. But as she stood over her father's grave, the wind on Whisperwind Ridge seemed to whisper a different story to her, a different promise. It was not a promise of peace or acceptance. It was a promise of retribution. In the month that followed, Clara became a ghost on her own land. She moved through the familiar rooms of the ranch house, a silent, black-clad figure, her face a pale, emotionless mask. But her grief was not dissolving her, it was forging her. The soft, youthful lines of her face hardened. Her eyes, once the color of a warm summer sky, took on the cold, hard glint of polished steel. She was not planning to flee. She was planning a war of one. She began her campaign not with a gun, but with a map. She spread her father's detailed survey maps of the territory across the heavy oak dining table. Her battlefield was not a town or a saloon, it was the wild and tamed country itself. Her target was not just a man, but an entire gang. And her weapon would not be brute force, but her intimate knowledge of the land and a cold, calculating patience that bordered on inhuman. She knew she could not face a dozen hardened killers in a straight fight. To hunt wolves, she could not be a lion, roaring her challenge. She had to become a spider, weaving a web so subtle and so deadly that the wolves would not even know they were trapped until it was too late. Her focus was Whisperwind Ridge. It was the gang's hunting ground, their kingdom. The winding, treacherous pass was the only practical route for heavy wagons for 100 miles in either direction. The Ridge Runners owned it. Clara intended to reclaim it, to turn their greatest strength into their tomb. She began to ride the ridge, not as a rancher's daughter, but as a predator studying its prey. She moved on foot, her steps silent, her form blending into the rocks and the brush. She spent days, from before dawn until after dusk, observing. She learned their patterns, their routines. She saw how they used the natural choke points, the blind corners, the high vantage points. She learned their numbers, identified their key men, and studied the arrogant, confident swagger of their leader, Silas Kane. As she watched them, the fire of her grief was channeled, focused into a cold, sharp point of purpose. Every laugh she heard from their camp was a new nail in their coffins. Every stolen trinket she saw them boasting of was another twist of the knife in her own heart, hardening her resolve. The promise she had made at her father's grave was no longer just a vow of blood. It was a meticulously crafted, deadly, and inescapable timetable of revenge. The wind on Whisperwind Ridge had sung a song of sorrow for her father. Soon, Clara Thorne would make it sing a new song, a song of fear, and its chorus would be the screams of the men who had wronged her. The planning phase was a slow, deliberate, and lonely act of creation. In the quiet, lamplit nights in the deserted ranch house, Clara Thorne became an architect of death. Her tools were not bricks and mortar, but the elements of the ridge itself, the loose shale on a steep incline, the ancient, precariously balanced hoodoos, the thick, thorny brush that grew in the narrow ravines. Her strategy was not to create a single perfect ambush, but a series of interlocking, sequential traps, the gauntlet of terror designed to dismantle the ridge runners not just physically, but psychologically. She would not just kill them, she would unmake them, stripping away their arrogance and their confidence, leaving them as panicked, terrified animals before the final blow fell. Her first task was to gather her materials. She rode to a town 100 miles away, a place where her face was unknown. She did not buy guns and ammunition. She bought tools. Heavy-duty rope and pulleys from a mining supply store. Forged iron spikes and heavy chains from a blacksmith. A large, barrel-chested man who eyed her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "That's a lot of iron for a young lady," he'd said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm reinforcing my barn against the winter winds," she had replied, her voice calm and steady, her eyes meeting his without a flicker of deception. He had shrugged and taken her money. Back at the ranch, she began to construct her devices in the privacy of the main barn. Her hands, which knew the feel of a rein and a rifle stock, now learned the feel of a drill and a wrench. She became an engineer, her mind a whirl of levers, counterweights, and trigger mechanisms. Her first trap was simple and brutal. She took the heavy iron spikes she had bought and, using a portable forge and her father's anvil, she hammered them into vicious, three-pronged caltrops, designed to cripple a horse and throw a rider. But she added a refinement. She drilled a small hole in the center of each, through which she could thread a thin, strong wire. Her second creation was far more ambitious. It was a deadfall trap, a classic but effective device. But its scale was immense. She identified a section of the ridge where the trail passed directly beneath a high, crumbling cliff face, littered with loose, heavy boulders. For a week, she worked with a crowbar and a pick, carefully dislodging several of these boulders, positioning them on the very edge of the cliff, held in place only by a series of smaller, precariously balanced rocks. The entire, unstable structure was connected by a single, heavy rope, anchored to a sturdy pine tree. Severing that rope would send a literal avalanche of rock and stone down onto the trail below. Her third trap was one of pure psychological terror. She chose a section of the trail that wound through a narrow, dark ravine, the walls thick with thorny, tangled brush. Here, she strung a series of thin tripwires, almost invisible in the gloom. These were not connected to anything that would cause physical harm. They were connected to a series of noisemakers she had crafted from old tin cans filled with pebbles, and to several large, empty gourds she had harvested. When triggered, the result would not be an explosion, but a sudden, terrifying cacophony of rattles and a cascade of falling objects from the darkness above. Designed to make a man believe he was surrounded, to break a cavalry charge and turn it into a panicked, confused rout. The physical labor was grueling. She hauled the heavy ropes and chains up the ridge on the back of a pack mule, her muscles aching, her hands dry and blistered. But with every spike she placed, with every rope she secured, a piece of her grief was transformed into a cold, hard piece of her vengeance machine. As she worked, she became a part of the ridge. She learned its secrets. She knew which rocks would hold her weight and which would crumble. She knew the paths of the deer and the coyote. She knew the way the morning mist would cling to the canyons, muffling sound, and the way the afternoon sun would create deceptive, lengthening shadows. She was no longer just Clara Thorne, the rancher's daughter. She was the spirit of the ridge itself, a patient, watchful, and utterly deadly presence. The grief that had been a raging, chaotic fire within her had been channeled, focused, and transformed. She was no longer burning with an uncontrolled rage. She was a weaver, and her web was now spun. It was a thing of rope, and rock, and iron, and it was nearly invisible, woven into the very fabric of the landscape. All that was left was for the flies to enter. The day Clara chose for her ambush was one of calculated perfection. A storm had passed through the territory the night before, leaving the air washed clean and a thick, soupy fog clinging to the high canyons of Whisperwind Ridge. The fog was a crucial element of her plan, a natural cloak that would muffle sound, obscure sight, and add a ghostly, disorienting quality to the battlefield she had so meticulously prepared. She was in position 2 hours before dawn, a phantom in the swirling gray mist. Her command post was a high, rocky outcrop, a natural sniper's nest that her father had once shown her, which offered a commanding, albeit intermittent, view of the entire stretch of trail where her traps were laid. She was wrapped in a heavy, dark wool blanket, her father's old Winchester rifle resting across her lap, its stock cool and solid against her cheek. She was not the same woman who had planned this vengeance. The weeks of hard labor and single-minded focus had stripped away the last of her softness. She was lean, her muscles corded and strong, her movements economical and sure. The grief was still there, a cold, hard knot in the pit of her stomach, but it was no longer a debilitating weakness. It was a whetstone, and it had sharpened her to a razor's edge. As the first, pale, watery light of dawn began to filter through the fog, she felt a profound, almost a natural calm settle over her. The planning was done. The web was spun. The time for thought and preparation was over. All that was left was the cold, simple mechanics of the hunt. She knew from an informant she had paid in the nearest town that the Ridge Runners would be riding that morning. They were due to hit a large, well-stocked freight wagon coming up from the south, a prize they had been anticipating for weeks. They would be confident, arrogant, and blinded by their greed. At just past 7 o'clock, she heard them. At first, it was just a faint, rhythmic thudding, a vibration felt more than heard through the soles of her boots. Then, the sound grew clearer, the jingle of harnesses, the creak of leather, the low, rough laughter of men who believed they were the masters of this world. Through a break in the fog, she saw them. There were 10 of them, a dark, menacing column of riders, with Solace the Jackal Cane at their head. They rode with an easy, confident swagger, their rifles held loosely in their saddle scabbards, their attention on the trail ahead, on the prize they were about to claim. They were wolves, entering a world they thought they owned, utterly oblivious to the fact that they were no longer the hunters, but the prey. Clara watched them, her heart a slow, steady, powerful drum in her chest. She tracked their progress as they entered the first stage of her gauntlet. They were approaching the narrow, dark ravine, the place of her psychological trap. She let the first 4 riders pass through. Then, as the 5th man's horse snagged the first tripwire, she leaned forward, her eyes narrowed, her entire being focused on the unfolding chaos. The nightmarish cacophony erupted from the brush on both sides of the trail. The sudden, violent rattling of dozens of tin cans, the hollow, thudding cascade of the gourds falling from the cliffs, the snapping of branches to the men in the ravine. It sounded as if the entire hillside was alive and attacking them. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The horses screamed, rearing and bucking in terror. The lead riders tried to turn back, crashing into the men behind them. The column, a moment before a disciplined line of predators, dissolved into a panicked, shouting, tangled mob. Ambush, one of them screamed, his voice a high, terrified shriek that was music to Clara's ears. "We're surrounded." They fired their guns wildly into the fog-shrouded brush, their bullets thudding harmlessly into the rocks and the trees. They were shooting at ghosts, at phantoms of their own panicked imaginations. This was the first part of her plan, not to kill, but to shatter their composure, to replace their arrogance with a primal, animal fear. As they struggled to control their terrified mounts and make sense of an enemy they could not see, she knew the first thread of her web had been successfully sprung. The whispers on the wind were no longer just the mournful sighs of the past. They were the harbingers of a swift and terrible doom. The chaos in the ravine was the overture to Clara's symphony of destruction. As the Ridge Runners, their nerves shattered, their discipline broken, finally entangled themselves and spurred their horses forward. They were no longer a confident band of predators. They were a panicked herd, their only thought to escape the unseen and herd enemy that had so unnervingly announced its presence. They galloped recklessly up the trail, fleeing the ravine of phantom noises, and charged directly into the second stage of Clara's trap. This section of the trail was a steep, winding incline, the ground a treacherous mix of loose shale and hard-packed dirt, and scattered across it, half-buried and nearly invisible in the gray, foggy light, were the dozens of heavy, three-pronged caltrops Clara had so painstakingly placed. The lead horse hit the first one with a high, piercing scream of pain and terror. Its front leg buckled, the iron spike driven deep into its frog, and it went down in a catastrophic, tumbling heap. The rider was thrown, his own scream a human counterpoint to the animal's, as he was crushed beneath the weight of his falling horse. The riders behind him had no time to react. They plowed into the wreckage, their own horses hitting the caltrops, their charge evolving into a horrific, tangled pileup of screaming men and thrashing, mortally wounded animals. The narrow trail became a slaughterhouse, a writhing mass of broken bodies, the air filled with the sounds of snapping bone and the iron scent of blood. From her perch high above, Clara watched the carnage unfold with a cold, detached precision. This was the brutal, impersonal mechanics of her trap. She had not fired a shot, yet nearly half of the gang was already out of the fight, their own panic momentum having been turned against them. But her work was not done. Silas Kane, the jackal, had been riding in the rear of the column. He had managed to control his horse, pulling it to a halt just before the field of caltrops. He and the three remaining riders, their faces pale with a mixture of rage and stark terror, stared at the scene of devastation before them. "It's a trap! A goddamn trap!" one of them yelled, his voice cracking with fear. "Get off the trail! Into the rocks!" Kane roared, his cunning mind finally reasserting control. He knew the open trail was a death sentence. Their only hope was to find cover. He and his remaining men leaped from their horses, scrambling up the steep, rocky embankment on the side of the trail, seeking a defensible position. They were reacting, just as Clara had anticipated they would, and they were scrambling directly towards the final, most devastating trap of all. They took cover beneath the high, crumbling cliff face, the very place where Clara had spent a week preparing her deadfall. They pressed themselves against the rocks, their rifles now in their hands, their eyes scanning the fog-shrouded ridge above, searching for the sniper, the enemy they believed was picking them off. Clara had them. They were in the kill zone. She raised her father's Winchester, its stock feeling as if it were a part of her own body. She was not aiming at the men. She was aiming at a single, thick, taut length of rope, tied to the pine tree 50 yards to her left. She took a slow, steadying breath. She thought of her father, of his kind face, of the life these men had stolen. The cold knot of grief in her stomach tightened into a hard, sharp point of pure, righteous fury. This was for him. She squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle was a sharp, clean sound in the misty air, the signal that unleashed the apocalypse. The heavy caliber bullet tore through the rope, severing it cleanly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a low, grinding groan echoed from the top of the cliff. A single, large boulder tilted, hesitated, and then began to fall. It struck the smaller, precariously balanced rocks below it, and the entire cliff face seemed to dissolve. The avalanche of rock and stone that descended upon Silas Kane and his men was not just an attack, it was an act of geological annihilation. It came down with a deafening, grinding roar, a tidal wave of granite that blotted out the sky. The screams of the men were thin, reedy sounds, instantly swallowed by the thunderous power of the rock slide. They were not just killed, they were erased, buried, consumed by the very ridge they had claimed as their own. When the dust and the echoes finally began to settle, the trail was gone, replaced by a massive, newly formed scree slope. There was no sign of the men who had been there moments before. They had simply vanished, their bodies now a permanent part of Whisperwind Ridge. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded horses on the trail below and the constant, mournful voice of the wind. Clara lowered her rifle, a single, spent cartridge ejecting onto the rock beside her. Her traps had worked, with a success that was more complete and more horrifying than she had ever imagined. She had done it. She had avenged her father. But as the adrenaline began to recede, leaving her shaking in the cold, misty air, a new sound reached her ears. It was a sound she had not planned for. It was the sound of a lone survivor, somewhere down in the wreckage of the first trap, screaming. A long, agonized, and utterly human sound of pain. And she knew, with a sudden, sinking feeling, that her work on this ridge was not yet over. The single, agonized scream from the valley of carnage below was a sound that cut through the cold satisfaction of Clara's victory. It was a raw, human sound, a testament to the brutal reality of what she had done. Her meticulously planned, almost impersonal vengeance had just been given a face, a voice. She reloaded her Winchester, her movements stiff, her mind racing. A survivor. It was a variable she had not fully accounted for. Her plan had been one of absolute, overwhelming annihilation. A loose end was a danger, a witness who could carry the tale of what had happened on this ridge back to the world. But as she began to make her way down from her perch, a different, more complex set of emotions began to war within her. The hunter, the cold, calculating strategist, knew that the survivor had to be silenced. But the woman she had been, the rancher's daughter who had been taught to value life, recoiled at the thought of a cold-blooded execution. The memories of her father, which had been the fuel for her rage, now returned in a different form. She remembered his kindness, the way he would sit up all night with a sick calf, the way he had taught her to splint the broken wing of a hawk. He had been a man of strength, but also of mercy. The thought of him, watching her now as she went to kill a wounded, helpless man, was a sudden, sharp pang of shame. This internal conflict, this war between the vengeful ghost she had become and the daughter of Samuel Thorne, raged within her as she picked her way down the treacherous, fog-shrouded slope. She found him near the wreckage of the first trap, pinned beneath the body of his dead horse. He was young, barely a man, his face a pale, sweat-streaked mask of agony. His leg was horribly mangled, trapped and likely broken. He looked up as she approached, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a desperate, pleading hope. He saw not a woman, but a phantom, emerging from the mist, a rifle held at the ready. "Please," he gasped, his voice a hoarse whisper. Don't kill me. My leg. I think it's broken." Clara stopped a few paces from him, the Winchester held steady, her face an unreadable mask. She recognized him. He was one of the younger, newer members of the gang, a boy with a swagger that had always seemed a little too forced, a little too desperate to fit in. "Why shouldn't I kill you?" she asked, her voice as cold and as gray as the fog around them. "You ride with the men who murdered my father. You're a thief and a killer." I ain't never killed no one," the boy stammered, tears now mixing with the sweat on his face. "I swear it. I needed the money. I got a ma and a sister back in Missouri. I was just the horse holder. I never shot no one. Not that day. Not ever." His words, his pathetic, terrified pleading, should have meant nothing to her. But they chipped away at the icy wall she had built around her heart. She saw not a highwayman, a faceless enemy. She saw a scared, stupid boy who had made a terrible mistake. She saw life that was about to be extinguished, not in the heat of battle, but in a cold, deliberate act of murder. The face of her father swam in her mind again, his kind, sad eyes full of a disappointment that was more painful than any anger. The rifle felt impossibly heavy in her hands. The boy, seeing the hesitation in her eyes, began to sob, a raw, broken sound. "I'll do anything," he pleaded. "I'll tell you everything. About Kane. About his operations. I'll testify. Just, please don't kill me." The hunter in her saw the opportunity. He was a source of intelligence, a tool she could use to ensure that the cancer of the Ridge Runners was truly cut out. The woman in her saw a chance at a different kind of victory, a victory that was not measured in death, but in a sliver of reclaimed humanity. With a low groan of frustration and self-loathing, she lowered the rifle. The decision was made. Vengeance had been her guide, but it would not be her god. She slung the Winchester over her shoulder and began the long, arduous process of freeing the boy from the dead horse, the cold, hard steel of the rifle a constant, heavy reminder of the line she had just, for the first time, refused to cross. The screams on the ridge had ended, and in their place, a new, more difficult, and far more human struggle had just begun. The wounded boy's name was Billy, And as Clara tended to his mangled leg in a hidden, sheltered alcove on the ridge, using the skills her father had taught her, the story of the Ridge Runners began to spill out of him in a torrent of fear-laced confession. He was not a hardened criminal, but a desperate farm boy who had fallen in with the wrong crowd, seduced by the promise of easy money and terrified of the man who led them. His information was a treasure trove. He confirmed that Silas Kane had not been with the group that day. The Jackal, cunning as ever, had sent his main force into the trap while he remained behind, waiting for them at their main camp, a fortified ranch house in a secluded valley a day's ride away. "He's waiting for them to bring him the loot from the freight wagon," Billy whispered, his face pale with pain. "When they don't show, he'll know something's wrong. He'll come looking, or he'll run." Clara's mind, which had been reeling from the emotional turmoil of her decision to spare Billy, snapped back into sharp, tactical focus. This was not over. The snake had been wounded, its body shattered, but its head, the most venomous part, remained. She now faced a new, more dangerous phase of her war. Her meticulously planned ambush was a success, but it had also been a declaration. Kane would now know that a new, deadly player was in the game. He would be on his guard, his paranoia and his cunning at their peak. "Where is this camp?" Clara asked, her voice hard, the brief flicker of mercy extinguished, replaced once more by the cold fire of the huntress. Billy described the location in detail, a place called the Lost Creek Ranch, a former homestead that Kane had taken over, fortifying it, turning it into his personal den. He described the number of men, at least 5 more, Kane's most trusted and loyal guards. Clara knew that a direct assault was suicide. She had the element of surprise on the ridge, but now Kane would be expecting her. She had to use the one weapon he did not have, intelligence. She made a decision. She would use Billy. "You're going to get a message to him," she said, her eyes boring into the terrified boys. "No," he cried. "He'll kill me. He'll know I talked." "He won't know," Clara said, her voice a chilling calm. "Because you are not going to tell him what really happened. You are going to tell him a story." Her plan was a dangerous, high-stakes bluff. Billy would be the sole traumatized survivor of a devastating attack, not by a lone woman, but by a large, well-armed posse sent by a rival freight company. He would tell Kane that the posse had hit them hard, that everyone else was dead, and that they were now riding for the Lost Creek Ranch to finish the job. "You will tell him that their leader is a man named Thorne," she said, a bitter, ironic twist. "You will tell him they are coming for him. You will make him panic. You will make him believe that his only hope is to gather his men and his gold and run." The goal was to flush the Jackal from his den, to force him out into the open, onto the very ground that she knew so intimately. It was a desperate gamble. It relied on a terrified boy's ability to lie to a man who could likely smell a lie from a mile away. But it was her only advantage. She spent the rest of the day drilling Billy, feeding him the details of the story, making him repeat it until it sounded plausible, until the terror in his voice sounded like the terror of a man who had survived a massacre, not the terror of a man lying for his life. As dusk fell, she helped him onto his horse. His leg was splinted and bound, the pain a constant, agonizing reminder of his situation. "If you betray me," Clara said, her hand on his horse's bridle, her voice a low, final warning, "if you tell him the truth, I will find you. There is no place on this earth you will be able to hide from me. Do you understand?" The boy nodded, his eyes wide with a fear that was directed entirely at her now. He understood. He was more afraid of the woman who had spared his life than the man who would surely take it if he failed. She watched him ride off into the twilight, a lone, pathetic figure on a desperate mission. She had spun a new web, this one not of rock and rope, but of lies and fear. And she had just sent her only and willing pawn into the very heart of the Jackal's den. Her own fate, and the final payment for her father's death, now rested on the trembling shoulders of a scared boy from Missouri. Silas Kane, the Jackal, was a man who thrived on control. His entire criminal empire was built on a foundation of fear, loyalty, and his own preternatural ability to anticipate the moves of his enemies. He sat in the main room of the fortified ranch house at Lost Creek, a glass of whiskey in his hand, a map spread on the table before him, and he waited. The waiting was the hardest part. His men were overdue. Long overdue. The silence, which should have been filled with the sounds of their triumphant return, was instead a heavy and settling void. A knot of cold and familiar anxiety began to tighten in his gut. When the lone rider was spotted, a single, frantic dust cloud on the horizon, the anxiety sharpened into a full-blown alarm. One rider, not a dozen. It was Billy, his face a mask of dirt and terror, who stumbled from his horse and collapsed into the arms of the guards at the gate. He was babbling, his story a torrent of panicked, disjointed phrases. They brought him before Cain. The jackal listened, his eyes narrowed to cold, reptilian slits, his gaze never leaving the boy's face. He let Billy tell the whole, wild story. A posse, dozens of them, hired guns from the freight company, led by a man named Thorne. An ambush on the ridge. A massacre. They were everywhere. We never had a chance. I'm the only one. They're coming here, Silas. They're coming to wipe us out. Cain listened to the story, and his sharp, analytical mind dissected it. A rival company. Plausible. A hired gun named Thorne. A common enough name, but the irony was a little too perfect. A massacre on his home turf. An unacceptable insult. He looked at Billy, at the genuine, slobbering terror in the boy's eyes. He saw the mangled leg, the authentic exhaustion of a man who had ridden hard and in great pain. The story was wild, but the boy's fear was real. Get him to the bunkhouse, Cain ordered his men. Give him water. Then get ready. We're riding out. His men looked at him in surprise. Riding out, one of them, a scarred man named Reno, asked. Shouldn't we fortify this place? Fight them here? No, Cain said, his mind already 3 moves ahead. This is what they'll expect. To bottle us up. To lay siege. He looked at the map, his finger tracing a path away from the ranch. We are not lions, to be trapped in a cage. We are jackals. We run, we circle, and we strike from the shadows. His plan was a classic gambit. He would make them believe he was running. He would abandon the ranch, taking his gold and his last few loyal men, and lead this posse on a chase into the Badlands, into a territory of his own choosing. He would lead them to a place called Dead Crow Canyon, a labyrinth of rock and shadow where he could turn the tables, where the hunters would become the hunted. He believed Billy's story. Or at least, he believed enough of it to react. The lie, so carefully crafted by Clara, had worked. It had flushed the jackal from his den. But Silas Cain had not earned his name by being a fool. As his men frantically packed gold and ammunition, he pulled Billy aside. You did good, boy, he said, his voice a low, almost fatherly purr. You saved us all. You're going to ride with me. Right by my side. The words were a praise, but the look in Cain's eyes was not. It was a look of cold, calculating assessment. The boy was a hero, a survivor. But he was also the only link to this new and known enemy. And the jackal always kept his assets and his potential liabilities very, very close. They rode out an hour later, a small, desperate column of 6 men, heading not for a fight, but for a flight that was, in itself, another trap. Clara, from her hiding place in the hills a mile away, watched them go. She saw the column of riders, saw them abandon the ranch, and a grim, cold satisfaction settled over her. The first part of her new plan was a success, but as she watched them through her field glasses, a new, cold knot of dread formed in her own stomach. She saw the lead rider, Silas Cain, and she saw the rider beside him, the small, hunched figure of the boy, Billy. He was riding with them, not as a prisoner, but as one of them. The blood ran cold in her veins. Had he betrayed her? Was this a double cross? Or had Cain, in his own cunning way, seen through the lie and was now using the boy as a shield, as a hostage? The situation had just become infinitely more complicated, and infinitely more dangerous. She was no longer just hunting a monster. She was now in a deadly chess game with a master player, and the life of the boy she had spared was now one of the pieces on the board. The chase was a grueling, 2-day affair that pushed both the hunters and the hunted to the limits of their endurance. Clara, now a lone pursuit rider, shadowed the small column of fugitives, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The presence of Billy, riding at Cain's side, was a constant, agonizing question mark. Was he a traitor or a hostage? The uncertainty gnawed at her, forcing her to be cautious, to hold her fire when a clear shot at Kane presented itself, for fear of what the jackal might do to the boy. She was being drawn deeper and deeper into the Badlands, a desolate, alien landscape of twisted rock and sun-baked earth. This was Kane's territory, and she could feel it. The very air seemed charged with a low, menacing energy. She knew she was being led, that the desperate flight was a deception. She was walking into a trap, and she had no choice but to spring it, for to turn back now would be to abandon Billy to his fate. The final destination was Dead Crow Canyon, and it was a place well named. It was a narrow, claustrophobic slash in the earth, its walls a sheer, crumbling rock the color of dried blood. The entrance was a tight bottleneck, and the canyon floor was a maze of fallen boulders and thorny, skeletal trees. It was a place designed for an ambush. Claire arrived at the canyon rim just as dusk was settling, the setting sun painting the rocks in fiery, demonic hues. She dismounted, leaving her horse in a hidden ravine, and crept to the edge, her Winchester in her hand. The scene below was exactly what she had expected. Kane and his 4 remaining men, Reno and 3 others, had taken up fortified positions among the boulders. They had their rifles out, their attention focused on the single entrance to the canyon. They were waiting for the large posse they believed was pursuing them. But her eyes were searching for Billy. She found him. He was not with the others. He was tied to a lone, dead tree in the center of the canyon floor, and open, in the middle of the kill zone. He was not a hostage. He was bait. The full, diabolical scope of Kane's plan crashed down upon her. Kane had seen through her lie. He had played along, letting her believe she was in control. He had used her own deception to lure her here, to this exact spot. He did not know who she was, not yet, but he knew she was the one who had spared Billy's life. He knew she had a weakness, and he had just staked that weakness out in the open for her to see. He was daring her to come and get him. The rage that filled Clara was a white-hot, blinding thing. It was not the cold, controlled fury she had felt before. This was a raw, personal hatred for a man who was so twisted, so evil, that he would use a boy's life as a simple gambit in a deadly game. The last vestiges of the old Clara Thorne, the daughter who had wrestled with the morality of her actions, were burned away in that moment. There was no more conflict. There was no more doubt. There was only the hunter and the prey. But she would not be stupid. She would not charge in. She would use the darkness, the terrain, and his own arrogance against him. She waited. She let the last of the light bleed from the sky, let the canyon be plunged into a deep, moonless blackness. She waited until the men below grew restless, their confidence turning to a nervous impatience. Then, she began her own game. She did not start with a gunshot. She started with a pebble. A single, small stone, tossed from the canyon rim, that clattered down the rock face on the far side of their position. The men jumped, their rifles swinging towards the sound. "What was that?" one of them whispered, his voice tight with tension. "It's nothing," Reno grumbled. "A coyote." A few minutes later, she tossed another one, this time to their left. Then another, to their right. She became a ghost, poltergeist, using the natural echoes of the canyon to make it sound as if the noises were coming from all around them. Their nerves, already frayed, began to shred. Then, she used her voice. She cupped her hands to her mouth and let out a low, mournful sound, like the cry of a hawk, letting the wind carry it, letting it bounce off the canyon walls, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. The men were now openly terrified, shooting at shadows, their discipline gone. "Shut up," Kane's voice roared from the darkness, a bellow of frustration. "It's a trick. Hold your positions." But it was too late. Their fear was a living thing now, and she was its master. This was her moment. While they were distracted, she began her descent. She did not use the main trail. She used a series of narrow, treacherous ledges on the canyon wall, a path she had spotted earlier, a path that would bring her down behind their main position. She moved with a speed and a silence that was almost inhuman, her body a shadow among the greater shadows. She reached the canyon floor 100 yards behind them. She was inside their fortress. She crept forward, her father's Colt now in her hand, its worn grip a familiar comfort. She could hear them now, their nervous whispers, the scrape of a boot on rock. She took a position behind a large boulder, directly behind the man named Reno. She could see his silhouette against the slightly less dark sky. She did not shoot him. She rose from the darkness, a phantom of vengeance, and put the cold muzzle of her Colt against the back of his neck. "Make a sound, and you die," she whispered, her voice a thread of pure, cold ice. Reno froze, a gasp of pure terror caught in his throat. "Tell your men to drop their guns," she commanded. "Tell them they are surrounded. Tell them now." The battle for Dead Crow Canyon was about to end, not with a massive firefight, but with a whisper in the dark, and the cold, undeniable authority of a woman who had become the very echo of fear itself. The tension in Dead Crow Canyon was a palpable, living thing. Reno, the hard-bitten, scarred outlaw, was frozen, the cold, circular pressure of the gun barrel against the back of his neck a promise of instant, final oblivion. He could feel the absolute, unwavering certainty in the hand that held it. This was not a bluff. "Do it," Clara's voice whispered again, a serpent's hiss in the darkness. Reno swallowed, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. "Boys," he called out, his voice a strangled croak, utterly devoid of its usual authority. "Drop them. Drop your guns. We're caught." The other three men, already on the verge of panic, reacted with a mixture of confusion and terror. "What are you talking about, Reno?" one of them called back. "Just do it," Reno shrieked, his voice cracking. From the darkness beside him, another of Kane's men saw a flicker of movement. He saw the shadow of the figure behind Reno and made a fatal mistake. He raised his rifle. Clara did not hesitate. The Colt in her hand roared, the muzzle flashed a brief, brilliant star that illuminated her grim, determined face. The man was thrown back, a single, dark hole appearing in his chest. The single gunshot was a spark in a powder keg. The remaining two outlaws, their nerves finally shattering, opened fire blindly into the darkness. Clara had already dropped, rolling behind her boulder as their bullets sparked and whined off the rock around her. The battle she had tried to avoid had begun, but it was a battle they could not win. They were firing at a ghost, while from the rocks 100 yards away, a new sound entered the fray. It was the crack of a rifle. Billy, tied to the tree, had managed to work the gag from his mouth. "They're behind you," he screamed, his voice a desperate, youthful cry. "She's behind you." Kane, who had been crouched behind his own rock, finally understood. This was not a posse. It was one person. One terrifyingly competent person. He had been played, his entire gambit turned against him by a single, invisible enemy. "Spread out. Flush her out," he roared to his last two men. The two men, caught between their fear of Kane and their fear of the phantom in the rocks, broke from their cover. It was the last mistake they would ever make. Clara, now lying prone, the Colt held steady in a two-handed grip, fired twice more. Her aim in the darkness was unerring. Two more bodies crumpled to the canyon floor. Now there were only two. Kane, the jackal, and her. "Come on out," which, Kane's voice echoed through the canyon, a howl of pure, frustrated rage. "Come and face me. I've been facing you all along, Silas," Clara's voice called back, her words seeming to come from the rocks themselves. "You just weren't smart enough to see me." She began to move, circling through the boulders, using the skills she had perfected on the ridge, her movements silent and traceable. She was the ghost, the whisper, and this canyon was now her hunting ground. The final confrontation was a deadly game of cat and mouse in the pitch black. A flash of a muzzle, a ricochet off a rock, the scrape of a boot on gravel. Kane was a skilled and experienced killer, but he was in her world now. He was a creature of loud, brutal force, and he was being dismantled by a silent, patient intelligence. The end came with an almost anticlimactic simplicity. Kane, trying to circle around to what he thought was her position, exposed himself for a fraction of a second as he moved between two large boulders. Clara was waiting. She had anticipated his move. She fired her last shot. The bullet took him in the leg, shattering his kneecap. He screamed, a high, piercing sound of agony and fury, and collapsed to the ground, his rifle clattering on the rocks. He was wounded, disarmed, and helpless. Clara emerged from the shadows, her empty Colt held at her side, her face a cold, pale mask in the faint starlight. She walked towards him, her steps slow and deliberate. She stopped a few feet from where he lay, writhing on the ground. He looked up at her, his face a twisted mask of hatred and disbelief. Who are you?" he gasped. Clara knelt down, so that her face was level with his. And for the first time, she let him see her, really see her. She let him see the cold fire in her blue eyes. "My name is Clara Thorne," she said, her voice a low, final whisper. "And my father was Samuel Thorne. You killed him on Whisperwind Ridge." Recognition, and a final, absolute terror, dawned in his eyes. He had not been hunted by a rival, or by the law. He had been hunted by a ghost. "Now you know," she said. She did not use the gun. She drew the long, polished Bowie knife from the sheath on her hip. "And now you will pay." The scream that was torn from Silas Kane's throat was not a sound of defiance. It was a sound of pure, abject terror. It was a long, ragged, and utterly final sound. It echoed off the walls of Dead Crow Canyon, a final, terrible testament to the completion of her vow. It was a scream that would, they say, become a permanent part of the wind in that damned and lonely place. The dawn that broke over Dead Crow Canyon was pale and hesitant, as if afraid of what its light would reveal. It found a scene of final, chilling stillness. The bodies of the last of the Ridge Runners lay scattered among the boulders, silent monuments to a night of absolute retribution. Clara Thorne stood over the body of Silas Kane, the bloody knife in her hand. The fire of her vengeance, which had burned so brightly and for so long, had finally consumed its fuel. It flickered and died out, leaving behind not the warmth of satisfaction or the peace of justice, but a vast, cold, and hollow emptiness. She had done it. She had fulfilled her promise. And she had never felt more alone. Her gaze fell upon the boy, Billy, still tied to the dead tree. He had watched the final, brutal act in a state of horrified silence. He looked at her now not with gratitude, but with a profound, unadulterated fear. In his eyes, she was not a savior. She was a monster, a creature of the night who had dealt in a form of justice far more terrifying than the lawless cruelty of the men she had killed. That look, the look of terror from the one person whose life she had chosen to spare, was a more damning judgment than any court could have rendered. She had won her war, but in doing so, she had become the very thing she had set out to destroy, a source of fear, a ghost whose name would be used to frighten children. Without a word, she walked over and cut him loose. "Go," she said, her voice a hoarse, empty sound. "Go back to Missouri. Forget you ever saw this place. Forget you ever saw me." The boy scrambled to his feet, his injured leg protesting, and hobbled away without a backward glance, disappearing into the vast, empty landscape, a final, living testament to the wreckage of her quest. Clara was alone now, truly alone, with the dead and the wind. She did not return to the valley. She could not. The ranch, her home, was a memory of a life, and a woman, that no longer existed. To go back would be to try and fit a ghost into a living person's clothes. She took Kane's horse, the best of the lot, and rode away from the Canyon of the Damned. She did not ride east, towards civilization. She did not ride west, towards a new life. She simply rode, with no destination, no purpose. She rode into the heart of the territory, a solitary, black-clad figure, a part of the vast, lonely landscape. The legend of the woman of Whisperwind Ridge was born that day. It was a story told not in saloons or in newspapers, but in the quiet, fearful whispers of travelers and teamsters who had to pass through that high, lonely country. They said that on certain nights, when the wind was just right, you could still hear the echoes of the highwaymen's screams, a permanent, ghostly reminder of the vengeance that had been delivered there. They said a phantom rider, a woman with eyes as cold and as gray as a winter storm, still watched over the ridge. They said she was a guardian, a spirit of justice. But the ones who knew the story best knew the truth. She was not a guardian. She was a ghost, haunted by the echoes of her own victory, forever bound to the ridge where she had lost everything, and then lost herself. The screams that echoed through the valley were not just those of the men she had killed. They were the silent screams of her own lonely and unforgiving soul.